燃え上がれガンダム
限界なんてない絶対なんてない限界なんてないって君の言葉に憧れてこの手を伸ばしたんだ限界出してないって笑ってまた雲見のない空の下踏み出すのさあの場所へ始まりなんて同じで熱くなったナイフが僕らの
Hello and welcome to Weekly Suit Gundam, the special bonus podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to set our GP bases, to begin Plavsky particle dispersal, and set our model damage levels to B, because this week on the show we are going to continue our dive through the world of Gundam Build Fighters, today with the sequel to the original Gundam Build Fighters, Gundam Build Fighters Try. Before we get into that, which is our main topic for today, Jonathan, we've got a little bit of news to talk about, a very rare news segment on this show, because Sunrise announced a couple of pretty big Gundam projects just the other day.
They are aware that we are getting close to the finish line. We have, like, this year, Sean, we're probably going to finish through Iron-Blooded Orphans at least. And Iron-Blooded Orphans is the last non-Build Fighters Gundam show, so they needed to give us something so we can keep reviewing Gundam, and they're doing it. They want this show to continue.
Exactly. They've seen that our train is heading to its last stop, and they're like, fuck it, we gotta lay some more track, guys. We can't let the Gundam train ever stop. So yes, so they have announced a couple of projects, but the big one is that the first full, proper Gundam show since Iron-Blooded Orphans, which is now about 5-6 years old, has been announced. There's not a lot of details. The main thing we know is that the show is called Mobile Suit Gundam The Witch from Mercury, or in Japanese it's called Suisei no Majo. And it's got a sick fucking logo, and that's about it. Like, we don't even know anything about staff. We don't know how long it's going to be, whether it'll be like a multiple season thing like Iron-Blooded Orphans or 00, or if it'll just be 26 episodes like Rekko and G. But we do know it is a proper AU Gundam, the next in the line, kind of as a successor in a general sense to Iron-Blooded Orphans. And this is very exciting because this is the first time since I have watched all of Gundam, because I finished watching Gundam around the time when Iron-Blooded Orphans Season 2 was wrapping up. So this is the first time that they've announced a whole new show since I was fully caught up on this thing.
It's pretty fucking cool. And it is such a good title. The Witch from Mercury, Suisei no Majo. The title treatment, no, we did not get a lot of info on it, but the title treatment itself, the logo, is so good. The use, the typeface they picked for the kanji and everything, it is so cool. It is such a provocative, silly, wonderful title. I love it. It's like, how do we one-up Iron-Blooded Orphans, which is a pretty fucking good title.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Witch from Mercury. I love how 2010s and now 2020s Gundam titles are just losing their shit. Reconquista in G, Iron-Blooded Orphans, The Witch from Mercury. Sky's the fucking limit. It's great.
Yes, and it's a very evocative title, because it immediately makes you start thinking of, new type shit. It's like, is Mercury the new Jupiter? Is it just you got a bunch of weird motherfuckers hanging around Mercury, just like there always is around Jupiter in more normal Gundam stuff? But yeah, I'm super, super excited to have that announcement. Just as it has been such a long time. They've been doing lots of projects, they've been doing movies, they've been doing OVAs, but it's just been such a long time since they did a full TV show. But this is not the only announcement. There was also, I'll just address it very quickly, there was an Iron-Blooded Orphans connected announcement. It was very confusing. I'm not entirely sure the full extent of what it is, but it doesn't seem to be anything substantial enough that I doubt it'll be something we cover on the podcast. But they're doing a compilation type thing. I think it's more of a series of very big episodes rather than movies. But they're doing a compilation project for Iron-Blooded Orphans, as well as there is a mobile game that has been in development for a long time that I think is coming out sometime next year, is what it seemed. And there will be some kind of new animated content around that that will be set between the 2 seasons of Iron-Blooded Orphans. But again, the sense I got from that is I think it's going to be light in terms of new animation stuff, and it's more about the compilation and about this game. But I'll be curious to see some of that stuff, and obviously we haven't yet covered Iron-Blooded Orphans on the podcast, but we'll see if any of that stuff comes up. But the other really big announcement that is the fucking crazy is that they have announced a movie. Like, every time I've seen it referred to, it's just full up movie. It's not OVA. They just call it a film. It is a movie version of the Kukuru's Doan Island arc from the original Mobile Suit Gundam. That also then has its, like, the reason this is happening is because it has its own manga that is sort of a pseudo spin-off from the origin manga. But it is the, like, what is in the West a very infamous episode of Gundam, because it is an episode of Gundam that has never gotten an official release in the West whatsoever. So if you buy a, like, Blu-ray of Mobile Suit Gundam over here from, like, a Western retailer, it will only have 42 episodes and not 43. Because this is an episode of Gundam that Yoshiki Tomino very famously does not like. But the fandom, particularly the fandom in Japan, does like Kukuru's Doan and Kukuru's Doan's Island. Like, Doan is a character that features in a bunch of the games and stuff like that. So it's not a totally inexplicable announcement, but it is, I think, an utterly hilarious announcement that they are giving our mobile suit martial artist his own fucking movie in Kukuru's Doan's Island.
Yep. If you want to hear us talk about that episode and the entire history behind it, you should listen to episode 3 of Weekly Suit Gundam, because that's when we would have covered episode 15, which is Kukuru's Doan's Island, which we both agree is it's the worst episode of OG Gundam, because it's just it's got the roughest animation. It's tonally off from the rest of them, but it's interesting. We didn't hate it. We certainly don't agree with Mr. Tomino that it should be stricken from the record. And yeah, it has had sort of a second life, because the origin manga by Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, a couple years after that ended, it wasn't him, but someone else sort of in his style did a spin-off manga that wound up being collected in 5 tankobon volumes, called Kukuru's Doan's Island, which does not appear in the origin manga. I've read the origin manga, and Yoshikazu Yasuhiko skips the Kukuru's Doan stuff. So he gets his own manga, and now they are making a movie, presumably based on that, being directed by Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, who has not done, like, a ton of direction lately, other than the origin, the OVA series that he directed, and now he's directing this movie. The dude just loves Kukuru's Doan.
Yeah, no, it's that is the thing about the announcement that is really exciting, because I saw all this stuff come up like on Twitter right when it was announcing, and so I was like trying to dig into the Japanese like press releases about this shit, and I was looking at it, it's like, oh man, there's no info on directors or anything for Witch from Mercury, and then I scrolled down and was looking at the Kukuru's Doan Island one, and then I saw there is only one person in any of these announcements that is like credited specifically as working on these projects, and it was just for the director of that movie. Yes, and it is Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, who, as you say, he has done some direction projects. He's most well known for being a mangaka with Gundam the Origin, and then he's done like a lot of really well-regarded manga. But he has done some direction. Most notably, recently, he's like a co-director on the Origin OVAs, because I think they kind of split, because that's a lot to direct, direction duties between 2 people. But yes, that's super exciting. That like gives me a lot of like confidence that it will be like a good project and not just something that'll be like kind of a goofy, funny thing that there's this Kukuru's Doan's Island movie. But I'm guessing, and this is what I said to you on Twitter, Jonathan, I'm guessing that announcement makes it feel like this project is probably happening because Yoshikazu Yasuhiko wants to do a movie and presumably just wants to do a Doan story. Because I can't imagine Sunrise wanting to put the amount of like budget and time it would take behind a project like this if they didn't know that they would have someone like Yasuhiko who's really well regarded and beloved in the community. Because the other thing, is that he is also the original character designer for Original Gundam and a lot of the other Gundam projects like F91 and Unicorn Gundam and stuff like that. So he is a really beloved kind of OG member of the Gundam crew.
Yes.
So if you get him on a project, the Gundam people will show up. And I'm I just love the fact that they're making a fucking
so good.
Doen movie. It's so great.
It's so great. I'm so excited. It also makes sense. The origin is super popular, the OVA series. And this is, like Unicorn Gundam got Narrative Gundam a couple years later, which is its movie sequel. This is effectively the movie sequel to the origin. Like, it will probably be in that style, right?
Yes, I'm assuming so.
Yeah. So that's awesome. It'll be good. I'm very excited for it. What an unexpected announcement. I would not have guessed that in a million years. I kind of love that Kukuru's Doan's Island is getting a movie before Crossbone Gundam gets any kind of anime.
Yep, it's crazy.
They are very stubborn on that.
But yeah, I mean, it's very exciting right now to be, in the world of Gundam, because we've got a lot of good projects in the works, because we've got those, and all of that stuff is set for next year also.
Yes.
So it's not that far off. But then also, obviously, we still have, like, Hathaway 2 is in development. There's still that Gundam Seed movie sequel thing, whatever form that takes, is still in development. So there's a lot of stuff in the pipe.
I have a guess on this, by the way. I'm guessing that this news means that Hathaway 2 is 2023.
Yeah,
and
I guess
because I can't imagine them doing more than one movie in a year, just as a theatrical release and a global release and all of that. So I think Kukuru's Doan is 2022 because they've said it is. Hathaway 2 is 2023, and I'm guessing that Seed movie is like 2024 after the next Hathaway. Like, I wonder if they're staggering it to like have one every year is maybe the long-term goal. All of that could change, obviously, depending on all sorts of things, but that seems like maybe the idea here.
That would make sense, because I think there was something about the announcement to the Seed movie that sounded more like we are, like, officially starting proper production on this thing that has been in some, like, weird, vague development hell for, I mean, at that point, it was, like, over 10 years.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, especially if they're, like, really putting their backs into the Seed movie and it's not a quick turnaround, because I'll say, like, I'm not expecting the Doan's Island movie to be Hathaway-esque in terms of its budget and scale. Like, I think, as you identified, I'm expecting something that's generally on the level of quality of the Origin OVAs, which are, like, really, really good, but they're not quite proper, like, what you'd think of as, like, a movie anime.
Well, that's what Narrative Gundam was. Narrative Gundam was, like, a slightly bigger budget episode of Unicorn, which was fine. It's beautiful. But, yeah, I would expect, like, another OVA episode with maybe a little more polish and longer, obviously, too.
Yeah, so that's what I expect from Doen, but yeah, I think maybe that Seed movie might be more properly like, we're going to do a big movie for this thing.
It also, like, if that's 3 years off, 2024, that will be 45th anniversary of Gundam. They're going to have something big for that. A Seed movie would be a good thing for the 45th. So, yeah.
Yep, exciting stuff in the pipeline. It's good to know that Gundam will never end, which means that we will always be able to do this podcast in some form.
Absolutely. And people have already been asking, how are you going to cover all this stuff? We're not sure. We will cover it, obviously. I don't think we're going to be doing, like, episode at a time on The Witch from Mercury every week. Because I don't think that's the way we enjoy watching it, or I think would be a good way to cover it. But, if it's, like, a one season with 26 episodes, definitely at the end of the season, maybe once per core. I don't know. We'll figure it out. We will cover it in real time somehow, like we have done with Hathaway and other new stuff that has come out. So the show will live on.
Yes, yeah. Gundam will go on forever till the end of time, which is very good.
Yes.
But that's the future of Gundam, Jonathan. Let's talk about, I guess I was going to say the present of Gundam, but this isn't the present. It's like 6-7 years ago in Gundam. And let's get to the main topic of this show, because we are in the midst of the build revolution, the beginning of, like, what I'm also guessing is going to be a very long running sort of sub franchise, because we will have still Build Divers and Re-Rise and all that stuff in the future. But we talked about on the last episode of the show, Gundam Build Fighters, our, like, beloved sports anime, the little sports anime that is just, like, an utterly phenomenal show, like, way better than anyone could have imagined. And then they made, about 6 months later, they made a sequel to it, Gundam Build Fighters Try. And this, I think, is going to be, based on Twitter, is going to be an interesting episode of the podcast, because I think this might be, Jonathan, I'm guessing, the show so far that we will disagree about the most, because I don't dislike this show particularly, but I wasn't super enthralled by it watching it, which it was also how I felt about it the first time. And Jonathan, what are your overall impressions on Gundam Build Fighters Try?
I love it. I think it's great. I love it. I think it is clearly not as good as the original Build Fighters, I also think that's a stupidly high bar to clear, that I would not expect a sequel made right after Gundam Build Fighters to clear. And one of the things I like about Try is that I don't think it really tries to, like, compete with it on that level. It is smaller scale. It is a little more insular and intimate. I think it does a lot of good things to distinguish itself, but the basics of it, you know, I'm a sucker for this kind of show. I'm just a sucker for it. And I think I could watch a show significantly worse than Gundam Build Fighters Try and still get some enjoyment out of it if it, like, crossed some of the boxes. But I don't think this is a significantly worse show than the original. I think it is different, and I think it is not up to that, you know, sheer par, but I like the main three characters a ton. I like that this show goes in sort of a martial arts direction and just goes full DBZ by the end. I think it's got really good action, especially in the second half. Kind of like the original Build Fighters, it gets better and better as it goes along. You know, I love the music, which is the same composer, a lot of the same score. I love the theme songs. I think the home stretch. I watched the last 8 episodes of this in one day, not because I was planning to watch the last 8 episodes in one day, but just because I just kind of got hooked on it in those last 8, and I think the last 8 in particular are really, really fantastic. It's got a great ending. I just like this show. I like it a lot. I will fully recognize this as partially just it's a taste, and it's a kind of like genre thing, right? Like, I just like this kind of thing a whole awful lot, this kind of sports anime silliness, and so it does it for me. I will also just say on a personal note, my family and me have been going through kind of a rough time, and I don't want to talk about all of that and why, but just there's been some hardship going on that has made the last couple of weeks very difficult for me personally. I don't know, if you listen to the Weekly Stuff podcast, you might have heard me just being short about things, and it's just been a tough couple of weeks personally, very much so. And having Gundam Build Fighters Try was kind of a beautiful just thing to engage with, because it is so pure and, like, hopeful and funny and simple and just simple goodness, and that meant an awful lot to me recently. And I don't know if I were in a totally better mental headspace if the show would have done it for me, but the second to last episode where you have the big final battle, they do it the same way as the original Build Fighters, where the final battle is the penultimate episode. The last 3 or 4 minutes where you have the big final fight set to the original theme song from Build Fighters Try, the new one, Cerulean by Back On. It's just one of my favorite Gundam scenes ever. I think it's a phenomenal, perfect ending, and it made me cry. And, you know, sports movies, sports anime are liable to do that, especially if you're in a certain headspace. And I really like this show. That's all. In fact, I like this show so much, I do have a star-winning Gundam Gunpla that I made, my first SD Gundam. This thing's fucking sick. I like the star-winning Gundam a lot. So, There you go. I kind of rambled there, Sean, but...
Yeah, because and I'm very glad that you like the show, because, I mean, this is something that I knew, like, you know, if people have listened to the Weekly Stuff podcast, people know that you're, like, you really love, like, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, you really love the Pokemon TV anime, which is stuff that I have fondness for, but I don't, like, I can't really go back and watch it. Like, whenever I go back to those shows, I just kind of get a bit bored by them. Yu-Gi-Oh! I like a bit more than the old Pokemon anime stuff, which I kind of find hard to get through, because I just find it very slow. Although I need to go back and watch some more Pokemon anime in Japanese, because since we did that for the first movie, I'm like, but that voice cast was very good. But the point being that, like, I definitely don't take as immediately to the, like, sports anime, particularly the, like, very silly sports anime thing is not always going to be, like, my absolute favorite genre. I do like lots of sports anime, but the main stuff I like is more like March Comes In Like a Lion, Chihayafaru, Kuroko's Basketball, stuff that's a little bit more, like, grounded in... I say grounded. I mean, Kuroko's Basketball is basically Dragon Ball Z, except for they play basketball. But
wait, I need to look this up. That sounds fucking great.
It's just, instead of going Super Saiyan, they get in the zone, and then their eyes get very, like, sharply animated and shit, and it's, like, fucking rad. But they basically treat it like it's going Trans Am or something in Double A Gundam, and it's fucking sick.
Okay, I'm bookmarking this right now.
Yeah. Kuroko's Basketball is an incredible show. But like, compared to, like, something like a Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is a little bit more, I think, specifically, especially Try is what it's going for. Those shows have a much more, like, kind of dramatic storytelling spine to them that the original Build Fighters does have. And I think that's the thing that Try mostly kind of jettisons, and that's the thing that I find sort of boring, I guess, about it overall, is I think Try is an extremely enthusiastic show. It's a super high energy show, and I appreciate those things about it. And occasionally I do think it's very well directed, and I often think its humor can be quite effective. Like, there are quite a few gags in Try that I really enjoy a lot. But my main issue with it now, which is the same issue I had with it when I first watched it, is that I think it just doesn't have a lot going on with its sort of like fundamental storytelling. And that's where, like, I think probably the biggest disagreement I have is that I just don't particularly like the home stretch of the show much at all, outside of the Tryon 3 stuff, which I think is probably the best thing in Gundam Build Fighters Try, because it's fucking hilarious. But the show doesn't do much in order to sort of build up, like, interesting character motivations. Sekai as our protagonist is a very flat, very generic feeling protagonist character to me that I get kind of tired of. And the show just kind of, instead of having had like good narrative buildups and things like that, and then have payoffs in the last like national tournament, the show just sort of settles into this very kind of cliche feeling mode where every episode is fairly interchangeable. There's not a lot in terms of like specific storytelling going on designed around the fights and things like that. So the fights become a bit tedious to me because they're not like strongly rooted in plots and themes and character motivations, which is all stuff that I think is accentuated by the fact that Gundam Build Fighters does all of that so exceptionally well, and that I don't feel like Try gets as much away from it as you're implying, Jonathan, at least to me, because it is constantly reminding you of Build Fighters, because you've got Sei is always like skulking around the corners of the show because he built the burning Gundam, right? You've got a bunch of characters like Ralsan and Meijin Kawaguchi from the first show that show up, and Build Fighters Try is, in a broad sense, structured the exact same way the first show was, with a preliminary tournament, a training section in the middle, and then the bigger tournament at the end, which is not a thing that the show had to do. There are lots of sports anime that don't go for that structure at all. So it's like the fact that it like cues just close enough to Build Fighter stuff to constantly remind you of it, but then also fails to, I think, for me personally, ever really replicate any of like the things about that show in its fundamental storytelling chops that was so effective and special. At the end of the day, Build Fighters Try is a show to me that like ultimately just kind of runs out of steam after the first maybe 5 or 6 episodes, where it runs out of new ideas to play with. And then it just kind of goes on for a while, and it's fine. It's like it's fundamentally like entertaining in a very basic way to me, but it fails to ever push past that. So I just got kind of bored of the show by the time I got to the end of it, which again is basically how I remember feeling about it the first time I watched the show.
I mean, I don't disagree with all of that. I think, the first thing I would say is, like, obviously, Gundam Build Fighters is a show that transcends its genre. It transcends its generic trappings. It transcends its, like, very obvious existence as a commercial. Like, it is better than what it needed to be. Like, you said that at the top of this show. We both said that when we talked about Gundam Build Fighters. Like, it is a show that I could recommend to someone who maybe doesn't even like sports anime kind of stuff, and I could expect that they would be into, right? And I do not think Build Fighters Try is something that transcends that in those ways. I agree that, like, its central story, like, the central storytelling of Try is much simpler. It is a group of friends who want to do well at the tournament. That's the story, right? Like, there is not this sort of, like, broader thematic focus that I think Build Fighters has. It does not have the sheer, like, deluge of characters and world building that the original has that, like, really fleshes that all out. I agree that on an episodic level, like, there are duds in Try where there are not in Build Fighters, and all of that is true. I still think, like, in terms of just the fundamentals of what I want out of this kind of show, it executes on that very well. I like the characters more than you, clearly, because I don't sort of share that. I 100% see what you're saying about, like, Kamiki Sekai, but I don't agree. I like him more than you do.
I would say, like, if there is one thing about the show that I think is, like, fundamentally the thing that hurts the show for me, it is that I think Sekai doesn't, for me personally, I don't think he functions effectively as a protagonist, and it kind of drags the show down a lot, but we can get into the specifics.
Well, yeah, we can get into that. I like him just fine. But yeah, I think I just demand a little bit less out of it, too. And I do disagree on the point that, like, the fights are not, like, motivated. I think that's true for some of them, definitely. I think there are enough good ones that do feel like they have significant character buy-in for me that I like them. But yeah, to me, it scratches the itch I needed scratched, and I really like the characters, and I think that's the main thing. Like, when I say it's not constantly making me think of build fighters, I guess I mean less in structure, because what you're saying is absolutely true, that it does hew close to that structure, and more just that the vast majority of characters on screen are new, and I enjoy those dynamics, and that's fun. I think it probably overcorrects for the problem of Gundam Seed Destiny, where Seed Destiny just gets killed by bringing in the old characters and having them just kick the new characters out of the show. Mm-hmm. This one kind of goes in the opposite direction, where it's sometimes a little weird that Sayori is only on the edges and not like coming in and saying hi at a certain point. But I would rather overcorrect than undercorrect for that, because Seed Destiny is a much... Like, I will say this, in terms of quick turnaround sequels to good Gundam shows, this is a right sight better than Seed Destiny.
This is a better show than Gundam Seed Destiny, yes.
Yeah.
This is not a show that, like... It's mostly not a show that infuriates me in the way that Seed Destiny does. Like, the way that... There are some things about the show that annoy me, but it's at a much smaller scale. It's like at a normal level of like, I wish they didn't do this level of annoyance. Mostly, I just kind of am a little bit bored by the show.
And it does
Seed
nothing
Destiny is a show I'm like frothing at the mouth about like frustrated, like, how are you doing this? What is the show doing by the time I get to the end of it?
Yeah, and there's nothing this show does like Seed Destiny that like negates wide swaths of the legacy of the original show.
Yes, yeah.
They don't bring in Sayori and make you fucking hate him, which they do with Kira, in Seed Destiny. So
God, that would be tragic.
That would be fucking tragic, right?
It'd be tragic, and I also think physically impossible. Like, I don't care who you are. I don't think you can make Iori unlikable, because he's everybody's son. Like, he's our precious little boy.
Yeah.
I love him unconditionally.
And I just want to say, when you say to the listeners that, like, I like this kind of thing, and, like, you mentioned Pokemon, just to stress for people who haven't heard me say this before, I watched every episode of Pokemon as a kid, like, in English on the WB. Like, and I say as a kid, I was watching it past the point where I could reasonably call myself a kid. I saw every single episode of Pokemon through the Kanto stuff, the Orange Island stuff, all 3 seasons of the Johto stuff, and most of the Ruby and Sapphire stuff. And it was somewhere in late Ruby and Sapphire when I gave up, so I have seen all of that shit. And the other day, I was, cleaning up, and I found an old Game Boy Advance video cartridge that I had. Do you remember these things, Sean?
Yes.
This was video you could watch on your GBA, and really it should be video in air quotes, because it's like at 6 frames a second, because GBA doesn't have a lot of storage. And it's a Pokemon cart that has the last 2 episodes of the Johto tournament in it. And I put this in just to like, oh my god, what did this look like, to test it? And I wound up watching the whole fucking thing. because it's a tournament, and I'm like, yeah, Ash, I want to see what happens in this tournament. And it's Pokemon, so Ash loses, obviously. But it's just, I like tournament shit. I will go for it. I love the fucking Tenkaichi Budokai in Dragon Ball Z, where they don't even fucking fight, because it gets abandoned like right away when Boo shows up, and like all the Majin Buu stuff with Babidi. Fuck it, I still love that part, because they're at least like they're making a bracket. I just like this kind of shit a whole lot. It works on me. I'm a sucker for it. There you go. Judge me as you will, or agree with me, because I'm sure there's people out there who are the same way.
Yeah, I'll say, like, I love tournament arcs. I just want... The thing that, like, kind of annoys me about this show is that, like, every great tournament arc is not just about... It's literally just a tournament. Like, it's usually... And then also here's, and then here's Tenshinhan in the Crane School, and he breaks Yamcha's leg, and, you have, like, more to the story, or here's Piccolo, here's, like, the Dark Tournament Saga, and Yu Yu Hakusho has a bunch of that kind of stuff. Build Fighters Try is, like, literally... This is just a tournament. Like, we're just showing up for a tournament, and there's nothing else to it. There's no strong character motivations. There's no intrigue. There's nothing going on behind the scenes. It's just like... And that's kind of, to me, I guess that's like kind of how I'd sum up the show, is like, it has very, very, very minimal narrative ambition. It is like, let's just show up and let's just do the tournament and then let's go home. And that's kind of what the show feels like to me. And that's where I get kind of disappointed by it.
Well, and then it comes down to how much do you like the characters, right? Because at that point, it's about the characters bringing their own motivations into the tournament, and those like conflicts and things that happen. And that's what this show is entirely about. Like, this show does not have a villain or anything the way Gundam Build Fighters does. And obviously Gundam Build Fighters villain is a bumbling idiot, but like there is an antagonistic force who's like trying to kick Sei out of the tournament, and that is like almost like in a Team Rocket sense of like, Sei's never going to lose to this guy, but he shows up and does something to like fuck up with Sei and Reiji every episode.
Yeah,
they
and
don't
it
do
adds
that.
a level of dynamism to what you can do with the fights, so that way it's not every single fight is just like, and now here's another fight. It's like, I think it's one of the reasons why tournament arcs almost always do that, is that it gives you this sort of like additional narrative level to play at that allows you to fill in the gaps between the fights and make them interesting, and then set up unique dynamics for every single fight. Which is, I don't feel like the show's super successful at it. But I think that's enough preamble. I guess let's, just to address like very quickly the history of the show, because there's not really a lot to talk about here. It's very simple. Gundam Build Fighters was massively successful. In particular, it sold a absurd amount of Gunpla, and so Bandai went to Sunrise and was like, make another one of those, and then Sunrise was like, okay. And then they turned around in what is like basically, I think it's even a little bit shorter than the gap between seasons in like a Double O Gundam or Iron Blooded Orphans, both of which are about like 6 months. And so they build the entirety of Tri, right, has that 6-month gap in order to sort of get all your pre-production and start animating the first episodes and all that kind of stuff to get it underway, which is a very short amount of time to start up in anime.
Yeah, the original series ended on March 31st, 2014, and the sequel, Tri, premieres on my birthday, October 8th, 2014. So, very quick turnaround there.
Yeah, so, and, you know, while that is, I think, a fine space if you're doing the sort of split season thing of Double O or Iron Blooded Orphans, where obviously a lot of, like, the pre-production work for Season 2 has been going on during Season 1 or even before Season 1 as they're crafting the story and the characters and all that kind of stuff. Build Fighters Tri, even though it has some elements for the original Build Fighters, is fundamentally its own show. It was not in any form of production while Gundam Build Fighters was in production. It was only announced, like, a couple of weeks after the end of Gundam Build Fighters as like, hey, we're doing it, we're making another one. And it is like, I mean, there are not a lot of interviews or like things on the record talking about like the production of this show, but like most of what I have seen is very much directly like, yeah, no, the Gunpla sold super well, so we made another show. And specifically, it was stuff like they talked about that the more revamped, like more original suits, so things like the Gundam Wing Fenice, and especially Bear Guy-san, those were the mobile suits that overall sold the best compared to a lot of the ones that are like just kind of like small modifications of an existing Gunpla, and that's one of the main reasons why Tri has very few like, here's an F91 with a slightly different color scheme kind of thing. Almost all the major mobile suits in Tri are completely original, right? Down to, like, the Build Burning Gundam, which is not in any way based on the God Gundam, which is called Burning Gundam in the original dub of G-Fighters. I see a lot of people think that the Build Burning Gundam is that, but no, that's just a total coincidence that it happens. Both shows have a lot of G-Gundam connections. They both have a thing that in English is called the Burning Gundam. But the Build Burning is a totally original suit. The Winning is SD Gundam is obviously a totally original suit. Most of the enemies have completely original suits that are modeled to evoke suits from the original. Like the Gunpla Academy team has a bunch of like Double O Gundam-esque suits, but they're not. This is an Exia with X, Y, and Z put on. They are original Gunpla. And that strategy works very well for Tri overall, because while Tri is nowhere near as successful, and I'll say that like my general opinions on Tri are pretty down the line of like what the majority of the fan base feels. I looked around both in English and Japanese just to see like where the opinions were on this show, and most people, like, I feel like have the kind of same general criticism that I have. So the show only sold about half as well in terms of like home video, DVD, and Blu-ray discs, but it sold an equivalent or maybe even a little bit more in terms of its promoted Gunpla. Particularly the Super Fumina sold ridiculously well for probably obvious reasons when we get to talk about the Super Fumina.
Because it's fucking great.
Yeah. But so that was kind of like the strategy around the show was very much like, we're going to give a quick turnaround. We're going to try to maximize the profit on Gunpla in connection to the show. And by those metrics, the show like is extraordinarily successful from like a business point of view, because even if it doesn't sell as well in terms of home video, its main function is to promote and sell Gunpla, and in that function, it is very successful.
Which I see why. I think there's a lot of very cool Gunpla in this one. I like seeing a lot of the original suits. They start doing a thing here that carries over into the OVAs also of like, oh, I see, this is like based on the Zeta Gundam, but it goes in a different direction. Like all of Yuma's suits are sort of like that sort of thing of like different inspirations, but then they do a totally new thing, and there's a lot of cool ones in here. So it's fun.
Yeah, and in terms of the staff making the show, it is like mostly like it's like 99% the same team. With like the most notable change is that the director of the original show then went on to do like eventually like My Hero Academia and that kind of stuff. So he was not here to do Try. So they brought in a sort of guy Shinya Watada, who is a big Sunrise guy. Like basically everything he's worked on, I think, in his like whole career is a Sunrise anime. And he takes over the franchise for Try. He then also directs stuff like Tri Island Wars and some of that stuff. And then he's kind of in charge of the Build sub-franchise from then on, because he's also the director of Build Divers and Build Divers Re-Rise. So they kind of hand off the reins of the franchise overall to Shinya Watada. But things like Yosuke Kuroda is still the writer. So he's the series composer. As you say, Yuki Hayashi is still the composer of the music. And so a lot of that and like the individual animators and stuff like that, it is broadly the same team, just with that like main directorial vision has been swapped out. And like you can very much feel the change in the director. Like I think you can tell how much influence he had because of how much My Hero Academia feels like Gundam Build Fighters. And Build Fighters Try. The little bit I've watched of Build Divers, because I watched like 4 or 5 episodes of it forever ago, and then I stopped because I couldn't watch 2 Gundam shows at the same time, one for the podcast and one to get ahead, and I was like, fuck it, I'll just watch Build Divers when it gets to it. Build Divers feels a lot like stylistically Try in terms of how it handles his characters and stuff. So it feels like it's part of like his style as a director is this sort of much more kind of lighter touch, not a lot of drama, like sort of leaning a little bit more on kind of cliche, the way that this has like the harem like protagonist setup and that kind of stuff. That seems to be a thing he's done in some of his other shows he's worked on that I've watched.
Interesting. I will say I think visually and in terms of like that aesthetic aspect of the direction and certainly the fights and stuff that happen, I think the show gets better as it goes along. I think I can feel a little bit of a learning curve in the early episodes of like, how do we helm this thing, kind of readjusting to now we're doing this team-based thing. I found all that stuff becomes quite confident by the end, and there's some really spectacular pieces of direction in the second half of the show. So we'll talk about that later. But I did not feel like this was a giant fall off a cliff or something where they got like some hack in to do it. That's obviously not.
Yeah. Like, because I would agree that I think like the direction in a technical sense is very good. And as you say, I agree that there's a bit of a learning curve. I do think in that last tournament, that's where the action is the most well directed. Like my problem with it is I personally just didn't have narrative buy-in to it. So no matter how well directed it is, if it doesn't make me feel anything because I don't like, I'm not invested in the story and characters, there's only so far that well-directed animation can go, but it is well-directed, and like the team that's animating it is very good. And it's a rare show where I feel like overall, not just in terms of the style of direction, but the quality of the animation of itself gets better on average as the show goes on. Because I think some of the early stuff in Build Fighters Try generally just doesn't even look that good.
No, it looks, I mean, it looks kind of like what it is, which is they had to turn it around really quick. And it wasn't something that was like planned the whole time, like Double Zeta or something. So like, but it gets better. Like I think it's totally on par as a production by the end with the original Build Fighters.
I would agree.
Even if you like, because a lot of what you're talking about are more scripting issues than they are direction issues. Obviously, the director has some like control over this, has some say in what the story is going to be, but a lot of that is stuff that would be in the writing.
Yeah, well, I mean, but part of it is like the conception of the show. It's like the director is heavily involved in that.
Right,
side.
of course.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, so where do you want to take it with this show? I mean, do you want to just talk about sort of the basic setup of the story as we get in those first couple episodes?
Yeah, so the sort of the main distinguishing feature of Try compared to the original Build Fighters is in the name, right? The Try part. So it's the concept is it's set 7 years after the original. Sei and our friends from the original show have all gone on to be like professional gunpla people. seemingly around the world. Gunpla has become a worldwide phenomenon, and seems even bigger based on the fact that now we're talking about national tournaments instead of world tournaments and stuff like that. So it's like a very ingrained part of the world, and now it has some different rules. One of the main rules being that now it is 3v3 fights, so you have a 3-man squad, basically, a 3-man cell, as they say in Naruto. And you put that together, and then you go to your tournaments, and you fight in your tournaments. So the first thing the show sort of does is it spends a couple of episodes setting up its team of the Team Tri-Fighters, featuring our 3 main characters, Fumina, the sort of captain of the team, then Sekai, the boy who calls the wind, as they say in the title of the first episode, who is really... Yes, Sekai is like really the protagonist. He's the character the show is by far the most invested in. And then you've got Kosaka Yuma, who is sort of our third, who he gets introduced and sort of part of the team in the second episode of the show. But that sort of 3v3 thing is the main thing I think the show kind of like leans on as its primary distinguishing feature from the original show.
It is an interesting choice, especially with a show that was turned around so fast that they jump 7 years in the future. I think that's a very interesting, and I do think there's a lot of choices like that feel like they're trying to, like, okay, let's not do the original show again. And then obviously in other ways, as you've noted, Sean, they do, in that they kind of repeat the tournament structure and that kind of like broad level stuff. But it's interesting, like they, especially based on the OVAs, they could have done a second season, you know, pretty straight. I'm ultimately glad they didn't, because I think there's probably a point of diminishing returns with that. And I'm happier to see something like this. But I do think the choice to like go way in the future is interesting. Not way in the future, but you know what I mean. 7 years is a pretty big jump for something like this.
It's long enough to, I guess, like my main theory on why you get this very odd element of Sei sort of skulking around the edges of this show, but you never actually hear him, is it's just long enough that you probably can't really use the same actress to voice Sei, because now he would be like 23 years old or something like that.
Yeah.
And so you would presumably recast the character to be an adult male voice. And I'm guessing they wouldn't want to do that. So it's like, it is just long enough that you can't necessarily just redo that stuff again, because they don't have any of the characters that were voiced by women in the original show. None of them come back, but most of the characters voiced by men, like obviously Meijin Kawaguchi, but even like Niels Nielsen, who was voiced by a guy in the first show, even though he was in the same age range as like Mao and Sei and Reiji, he gets to show up briefly and is just played by the same actor, just dropping his voice a little bit in his register.
Yeah, so it seems like maybe the thought was, let's not think about that too hard. That's going to be a big job if we have to like recast parts and completely redesign characters. Because like Meijin, you don't really have to redesign that much, especially because he's got a fucking visor and costume on. Niels is like the only major character who has to get like a wholesale redesign, right? Like even Sheena, when we meet her, who is Yu's older sister, is not that heavily redesigned. So, which I understand if you're making a show in 6 months after the original show. But yeah, I really like the first episode of this show. The first two, it's kind of almost a two-parter, but I really like Fumina. I think she's a cool character. And, you know, the whole show kind of starts with her as she's alone in the Gunpla Club, which is a plot point they kind of abandon after this, but like at the school, Gunpla fighting has become unpopular. And I was unclear in those first couple episodes whether that meant like, is Gunpla fighting unpopular nationwide? And I guess it's just at that school, because otherwise Gunpla fighting is as big as ever.
Which is weird, because it is, to be clear, it is also the school that Sei went to. So it's like that room, it's like he's got the trophy from the tournament from the original show, which is an important plot point. So it is like that school, where I feel like if you were a school that produced the world champion in what was a very popular sport, there would be a lot of people going to that school specifically to like be a part of that program, because it's like, it's one thing to be a national champion, to be the world champion or something like that is like, that's a fucking feather in your cap.
It is. So, for whatever reason, Gunpla fighting has kind of given way to Gunpla building at the school, because now there are just, like, Gunpla building tournaments as well, which is what Yuma is doing at the start of the show. Yuma and Fumino had a promise when they were younger to fight Gunpla together. Then Yuma had a traumatic event and is suffering from Gunpla PTSD, GTSD, Gunpla traumatic stress disorder, and he does not want to fight anymore. And so Fumino winds up meeting Sekai, who is a member of the Jigen Haoryu, Haoryu, which is the Jigenhao School of Martial Arts of Kenpo. And if you wanted to play a drinking game that would definitely kill you, take a shot every time Kamiki Sekai goes, Jigen Haoryu! And if you binged, let's say, 3 episodes in a night, you would die. He says it a lot because he's very invested in it. He's kind of a country bumpkin who just has lived with his master studying martial arts for many years. And so he comes to the city, and Fumina sees that he can fight, and she puts him in the gunpla room, and he realizes it's fun because he can make the gunpla move like it's doing the Jigen Haoryu moves. And so there we go. And they fight together, and then in the second episode, they get Yuma on board. They show him their feelings with their fist, which is an idea from the Jigen Haoryu and from anime, and and then they're a team, and I like it. I think it's a fun start, and I like the basic composition of the team.
Yeah, so for me, I guess a couple of things that are frustrating about the show a little bit early on is that, like, the characters, other than Yuma, who is the only character of the 3 that feels like he's got, like, a specific motivation, like Fumina and Sekai in particular kind of don't have much of, like, a good narrative momentum, which is, like, is broadly fine in that, like, you don't need the character to have, like, this is my life's mission, is to be the world's best gunpla fighter because another gunpla fighter murdered my father, or whatever, like, ridiculous thing you want to give, right? To give them, like, a super strong specific motivation. But it does make the show's narrative and, like, storytelling pretty aimless overall, is that, like, Fumina's goal is just to go to the tournament and compete in the tournament, and that's, like, basically it. So her main, like, character motivation is resolved in, like, the first 4 or 5 episodes. And then Sekai is, like... So Sekai is obviously, he's built in the model of a Goku-esque shonen protagonist, that he's a martial arts boy who's kind of an idiot, but he's got that, like, you know, country intuition where it's just like, he's just got that passion and he's going to get through it no matter what. And through his passion and his dedication to the martial arts and all that, he can understand why people are fighting through his fists and all that kind of stuff. And his main motivation is to, like, get stronger, is what he vocalizes multiple times. But he doesn't have anything on top of that. And I think that's part of the problem for me with the show, is that protagonists that are built in that model, even the ones that are, like, very simple overall, still usually have, like, something, right? They have, like Goku in each individual story arc always has a clear motivation that is, like, a specific thing. Like, Tenshin Han broke Yamcha's fucking leg, so I want to win this tournament. And you have the whole, like, school and all that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sekai is more like Dragon Ball Super Goku, of, like, if you look at, like, original Dragon Ball and Z Goku, I think in the popular imagination, Goku has been flattened out a bit. He has lots of motivations around, like, his family and, like, the Dragon Balls and Bulma and, like, all sorts of things. And in Dragon Ball Super, it usually is, like, he just wants to, he is very flattened as a character by the time of Super, because it kind of has to be. That's a whole series that takes place between arcs in Dragon Ball Z. And he's sort of, like, on that level, but, you know, even in Super, you have stuff like, well, Goku also wants to win because the whole universe is going to get destroyed if he doesn't, and obviously Sekai doesn't have that. So I see what you mean. It still works for me in the same way Goku still generally works for me in the lesser stuff, but yeah.
Yeah. And this is where, like, and I don't want to just do comparisons to the original all the time, but it is a thing where, because they have very similar plot structures, and the first one is so good, it's, like, hard not to just immediately reach to that as an example of, like, what the original show does is, in the second episode, it does the Yuki senpai fight where they lose to him, and that is, like, Reiji's goal. Is it starts not about him being into gunpla, but it starts with him having his honor be, like, insulted because he lost in this fight, and he wants to beat this guy. Not just be good at gunpla, he wants to win against Yuki for, like, a very specific reason. And then over the course of the show, that shifts more to it being his love for the game and the sport. And that's what it's really about. And something, and that's what I mean, that, like, it can be something very small, but I wish that there was something that Sekai had that they could introduce, like, around this point, because it's just, there's not much driving his character. He just kind of joins the team on a whim because they don't have a martial arts club, and he's like, I could do martial arts shit with this, that's cool. And then the kind of show just, like, never really gives him something more beyond that after that point.
Yeah, I mean, I this is a case where, like, I'm not gonna disagree. I just will say it doesn't bother me as much, right? I find the character charming, I find the vocal performance very charming, and that's kind of enough for me in this, because he is I guess, the most central of the three. He's first among equals, but it's like the other two do matter a lot. And I think Yuma winds up being a very compelling character to me. I like him a lot. And I think you're maybe selling Hoshino a little short, not completely. I totally get what you mean. I think her motivation isn't like just to win. Obviously, it's also to like have friends and have a team. Like, that's a big idea of the show. And yes, that is something that's roughly resolved a couple episodes in, because no one after that is like threatening to abandon her or anything. You do also have the little thing about her like being inspired by Lady Kawaguchi, which I think they could have done a little more with, because there's an interesting, I think they do a nice thing of that it kind of starts and ends on that point, but there's some other things in the middle you could do with that. So yeah, no, the motivations are fairly flat. They want to go to the tournament and win, but I want to see them go to the tournament and win, so I'm good with that.
Yeah. This is also where you get like a running thing of you have a lot of specific G Gundam references in the show, right? So it's like, because this is, you know, G Gundam had its references in Build Fighters, but they were mostly like put to like, in the original Build Fighters, whenever they had a random mobile suit that needed to just get blown up in like a sort of cutaway shot, they would just pick, what is the most ridiculous bullshit mobile suit you can get from Gundam Build Fighters? The snake one, let's blow it up. The fucking windmill one, let's blow it up. Like the Zeus one that's like a weird like centaur man, let's blow it up. And that's kind of what the like racist Mexican one, let's blow it up. Like, that's what the Build Fighters did. Build Fighters Try is specifically calling to a lot of specific elements of G Gundam. The most obvious one being that, you know, this is Gundam Heaven, so Domon Kashu is there, and Domon Kashu is Sekai's master. Like, he's unvoiced.
Okay, do you want to just talk about that right now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, because that's the last like shot of the show, but like
but it's also like one of the first shots of the opening animation for the first OP. So it's like you see a silhouette of Domon Kashu at the beginning of like 12 episodes.
Yeah, because they keep it like coy, like for obviously for most of the show. Like, he has a master and he's off screen, and like it means a lot to Kamiki Sekai. And I was sort of wondering for a while. I mean, I guess you have that silhouette in the opening, but you know, it's like, oh, which character are they going to pull on? Is it an original character? Is it something else? And in the finale, they just revealed that it is Domon Kashu. And so, Sean, I think you're just right. This is Gundam Heaven. Your big elaborate fan theory from the previous episode, which if you haven't heard, you should go listen to. One of the craziest moments in Weekly Suit Gundam history, except now I don't think it's crazy at all. I think you're just right. I think Domon Kashu died, and in Gundam Heaven he started the Jigen Haoryu, and he just teaches people how to do cool martial arts.
Yes, he teaches people how to cool martial arts, and then he also teaches people to, if you have a member of your family that is missing and you need to find them, you got to beat somebody up and then take a picture of them and shove them in their face and say, have you ever seen this person before? Because that's how Sekai is introduced. I mean, he doesn't like just go and beat people up. He gets like sort of like accosted in an alleyway, and then he uses his Jigen Haoryu Kempo, and he shouts like Jigen Haoryu Seikenzuki 500 times, as he does in every fight. And then he shows them a picture of his sister. And this is where there is something about this series that there's a weird part of the show, which is that the characters' ages and their character designs don't always line up in a way that feels really weird to me. And that Sekai looks like he's like maybe 3 or 4 years younger than like Fumina and Yuma to me. He's way shorter, he's way skinnier. It's because Yuma also is voiced by Uchida Yuma, who's just like a guy. He was like 25 years old or something when they did it. And Sekai is voiced by a woman, that like the character reads as being much younger in a way that is like a little bit weird, because he's supposed to be Yuma's age. He's supposed to be a second year in, basically an 8th grader, a second year in middle school in Japan. Fumina is a 3rd year student, so more or less the equivalent of a freshman in high school. She should be about 14. And then you also now have Sekai's sister, Mirai, who is also supposed to be the same age as Fumina, because she is also a 3rd year middle school student at Seiho Academy, but she looks like she's like 18 years old and she works as a professional model. And it's like,
I didn't catch that she's at the school. I totally thought I thought she was like 20 or something, because she seemingly has custody of the kid. Like, I thought she was like being like a single mother, basically. I know she's his sister, but I thought like their parents were dead and she was raising him.
No, they're only 2 years apart in age.
That makes no sense whatsoever, and I kind of love it.
Yeah, it is really weird, and it's just that thing of where it like Yuma has a crush on Mirai, but she's only like the way that she's only 1 year older than him, but she looks like she's like, again, she looks like she could be like a student teacher at the fucking school. It's very weird. But yes, he's going to go see his sister who is at the school, because that's why the bullies or the cops like bring him back to the school, and or no, she comes to pick Sekai and then brings him with her to the school, and then in a later episode she is in a classroom as people go grab her to go get to Sekai. So she is at that school, a third-year student, the same age as Fumina, and it's very weird.
I am on the Wikipedia page. They call her his legal guardian, so I'm confused. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe the rules of guardianship are different in the Gundam Build Fighters world. A lot of things are different, so yes. Whatever. This does not bother me, and I don't think you're saying it's like a huge problem or anything.
No, the Mirai sister thing is just like a goof. I do think that when they start to do the like romance thing between Fumina and Sekai, I think it does like hurt it a bit that like visually their ages read very different to me. So it's like I never really buy Fumina's like romantic infatuation with Sekai, which becomes a like thing that becomes a bigger thing they lean on as the show goes on for their like harem protagonist jokes that they do.
I guess I see what you mean there, but I did not feel comic like Sekai read quite as young as you're saying. Like he reads youthful, but I didn't like the character design didn't look that younger than the other characters. It's sort of a Goku thing where there's just a youthfulness, but I didn't take it that same way.
I think it's just that like, you know, if maybe you're telling me that like Sekai hasn't hit puberty yet, but Yuma has, I can kind of buy it. But Yuma's like a foot taller than him.
Yeah, that's, I don't know. Goku's like 14 when Dragon Ball starts. It's silly anime stuff. Whatever.
Yeah, but like the other person that's around that's the same age as Goku is Krillin.
Okay, that's a good point.
Also tiny.
Yeah, that's a good point. Men in Dragon Ball just have very delayed puberty.
Yes, well, they're either like a child, and then they're just a child forever like Krillin, or they eventually just, all of a sudden, they're like an adult man, or they just start as an adult man like Yamcha, and they just stay that way.
That's fine, yeah. Anyway, we're getting off track here, but yes. The thing about this show, like one area where I do have like personal legitimate criticism is I do think the pacing in the first, I want to say like 10 episodes or so is a little rough. I think it's much less confident about exactly where it wants to start than I think Gundam Build Fighters is, which Gundam Build Fighters is, as we talked about last time, it's through the preliminary like round of the regionals in like what, 6 episodes?
Yeah,
like
it's 5 or 6 episodes.
5 or 6 episodes. 5 or 6 episodes in this, you're sort of just starting the like regional qualifiers, and I think there's a little more just like stop and start pacing, and some of the episodes are a little weaker. There's some good stuff in there. Like we'll talk about Gyanko. I love Gyanko, and I love that there's an entire family ongoing of these siblings who are all into the Gyan. Obviously, those characters were made for me, because if I were in this world, I would be one of those family members, so it makes sense. But I do think it's a little stop-start. I think once you get where I really thought the show was a little more coming into its own for me is when you get to like the training arc in the middle and then the nationals. I like all of that stuff. There's no point where I disliked it. I just thought that the pacing is a little slack, certainly in those first 9 or 10.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that I think like the pacing in the show, and I would, for me, it kind of extends through the whole show because it ends up having to compress the entire national tournament into a span of about 8 episodes. That like it spends a lot of time here and then in the training segment, both of which, if you're comparing it to the original Build Fighters, like the preliminary tournament section is longer than it was in the original Build Fighters, and the training section is a longer number of episodes than the original Build Fighters. So they're left with like a pretty small number of episodes, less than 1 core of the show, to do the entire national tournament that the series is like supposed to be building up to, which is I think is part of the issue I have with the show, that I think like build up and payoff is like very out of whack in the way the show is kind of structured and built narratively.
That's fair. And it's the kind of one mistake they make, and I do think this is true, and it's what you said earlier of like one thing Build Fighters does really well is episode 1 is Sei and Reiji, and episode 2 is meeting Yuki, who will become Meijin Kawaguchi, and having a fight and losing and not like hating that person, being really like they respect him so much that they really want to have this fight, right? And Reiji is fired up by that, and so 2 episodes, boom. This show like because the main antagonist, not antagonist because they're not evil, but like the rivals wind up being the Gunpla Academy, who don't really come into the focus until the training arc. That means that the regional qualifiers thing is sort of on an island, and it's more just establishing the Tri-Fighters. And then after that point, one reason why the training arc has to be longer is it's where you're setting up all of the main figures that will be there for the national tournament. And Gundam Build Fighters is just, I mean, Gundam Build Fighters is like Tomino-esque in its narrative economy, and we talked about that, like it is cut above most things in terms of that just sheer level of narrative economy, but obviously it is much faster at establishing those elements.
Yeah, because just like as like a specific comparison point, in the original Build Fighters, the World Tournament begins in the episode called The World Tournament Begins, which is episode 10. And by that point, you have already done the preliminary tournament. You've obviously established your main two duo and the Yuki Senpai dynamic. You have also had an episode that has a lot of Niels Nielsen stuff in it. You've established Isla as a major character. You've already done a bunch of stuff with Fellini, right? Because you've had his whole thing of training with Sekai. You have Mao is already well established, and they've had a fight with Mao. So by episode 10, the World Tournament is started, and the show has already like introduced and given narrative like room to build and start developing every single major character that then features in the World Tournament. And for Gundam Build Fighters Tri, the World Tournament doesn't start until episode 15, and by that point you have only had about 2 episodes to even like introduce and play with at all any of the characters that show up in the World Tournament arc, because none of them feature in any episode prior to that, other than like vaguely the Ado Saga character in Yuma's like sort of nightmare like flashback, his Gundam this Gunpla post-traumatic stress disorder, as you say.
You also have the Kansai character who is there from the beginning.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So you have Minato, who he is like he's like Minato is I think one of the few things that I have like no qualms about how the show handles.
Minato is
like
fucking great.
I think he's like, in terms of like the story and the execution, he's like the best done part of the show overall. But he's also not the like final opponent, right? He is your like, he's the opponent in the semifinals. And so that structure is just sort of, I think that's where you get this sort of meandering quality to the first 10 to 12 episodes of Tri, is that it's just like working towards some sort of like vague goal of winning this tournament that I guess gets you to the nationals, and I guess these are your opponents, but you've never really seen them before, and there's not a lot of good like clear goals, clear motivations, clear narrative structure to be set, so that way you can play with the stuff within the individual episodes and have like that large like big picture stuff be very clear. I think that's important for a show like this, and in Tri, particularly in that first section, it's very mushy.
It's definitely, there's some slack there. I think there's a limit to how much we should be making comparisons to the amazing narrative economy of the original show, because it's just a stupidly high bar to clear. And I understand that it's the direct like predecessor to this. You know, this show does have different goals in some places. Part of it is that this is a 3-hander, not a 2-hander. It's got a little bit more to do in terms of balancing that main cast. The national tournament is also just simpler in this show than the world tournament is in the original series. The world tournament is bigger. It is the world. It has this whole like preliminary round where they're doing all the different games and stuff that they don't bother with in this show. So, you know, it's not a direct one-to-one is the only note I would make there.
Yeah. But like, I want to say that's stuff that's all. But like the way that Gundam Build Fighters does it, while it does it exceptionally well, the way it is doing it, broadly speaking, is fairly standard for the genre, I guess.
Sure.
Like it's a thing that most of these kinds of series have early on, a set up, really clear goal that the characters are moving towards. That goal is then also personalized through a handful of characters or a primary antagonist, or however they choose to express it, and that's like a pretty standard setup.
Yeah.
And it frustrates me that Tri just like sort of it, because Tri ends up kind of doing it, but it only does it at the midpoint of the show, which to me is like a bit too late, because I've sort of lost a lot of my investment in the show by the time you get there.
This is much, yeah, because you're totally right. I mean, even down to something like a Pokemon, he's fighting Gary in like episode 2, right? Like,
yeah,
or Yu-Gi-Oh is Pegasus is like the first, Pegasus and Kaiba are episodes 1 and 2, and then those are the main antagonists for that entire first like 60 episodes. So yes, it's as you say, it's very standard. Even if Build Fighters maybe does it particularly sharply. it is a slack point in this. This show is definitely more a like live in the moment show. The characters like goals are much more. Sekai's like, I want to fight strong people. This person's strong, cool. Hoshino senpai wants to, have a team and have friends, and Yuma has sort of the long-term goal of like, he's the one with the sharpest goals, obviously. And he has, I think, the best moments in the final episodes because of that. Like, several of my favorite moments in the show are Yuma stuff near the end because he is by far the most highly motivated in a concrete sense.
Yeah.
So,
and he's the one who has the like rival, right? So he's both got his personal character motivation of overcoming his weakness, and he's got the rival in Minato Sakai, which is like are two things that neither of the other characters in the Tri-Fighters team like has. Like they don't. I guess like technically you've got like they introduced a rival-esque character for Sekai in Wilfred Kijima, but they don't really have, I think, much like chemistry together. You get a little bit more with Fumina and Shia because at least you have like the harem protagonist bullshit all around that creates some sort of like automatic rivalry. But again, all that stuff is introduced about episode 12 or 13. So it's like Yuma's like the guy that kind of front load with a lot of narrative elements for him to be able to work with.
I think if you could do a second draft of this story, all the pieces are there if you wanted to put them in a better order. Like, here's a couple things I would do if I were doing my in-my-head fanfic rewrite of Gundam Build Fighters Try. So, one is, you have this character in the national tournament, and I forget his name, because he's really only in one episode majorly, but it's another fighter from the Jigen Hao school. And he and Sekai were friends as kids, and then he left the Jigen Hao school, and now he's, like, learning all these other Kenpo techniques and stuff. That should be the head of the Gunpla Academy team. Like, very obviously, like, that is just... Wilfried Kijima is fine. I have no problems with the character, but, like, just on the simple fact that he's not a martial artist, there's a, like, limitation to what he and Sekai do in fights that you do not have with that other character. And I think the episode is really good, and it's one of the better Sekai episodes. It's where you get the big assimilation, like, going Super Saiyan moment, like... Obviously, like, it's more motivated than Sekai usually is in terms of just that concrete person you're looking at. And then I feel like the third, because then you have another character, you have Suga on that team who is Yuma's rival because he beat Yuma terribly once, right? Yeah. So, okay, those are two pieces. Then I feel like that third character who is a character who's very all over the map in Try. It's this girl who sort of starts out in the model of what's her name, Reiji's girlfriend from
Isla.
Build Fighters. Starts off in the model of Isla. Really isn't. Like, she's much more just straight and down to earth and just likes building Gunpla. And she's a nice, pleasant character. I feel like that character should be someone who used to be at Seiho Academy and was like Hoshino knew. And then I think the story should be that Gunpla Academy started poaching people from Seiho Academy. And that's why their Gundam team is, like, shit, and why Hoshino is really sad, and she never wanted to leave. And then, like, it is... Like, make the Gunpla Academy just a little more of assholes, because this is kind of set up as an underdog sports story, a la the Karate Kid, but you don't have, like it kind of needs the Cobra Kai element of, like, the assholes who are sort of, like, poaching people. And I feel like if you did that and just kept almost all the rest of the show the same, it's great. Because I think a lot of those, like, I like Sekai and Hoshino as characters a lot, but I would agree with you 100%. I don't think you need to change anything about them inherently, but giving them more motivation would just automatically make them more enjoyable.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because you have that Junya character, which is the, like, other martial artist disciple. Right. And yeah, like, I think that story in and of itself works well, but this is, like, the problem with, like, not having good build up and payoff is that that character's introduced effectively. Like, I guess he's in the background of a couple shots, but you have no idea what the fuck he is. It's just like, here's a mysterious character that's hanging out with fake Slugger Law guy who's very funny. But you don't know anything about him, and it's not really until the episode before they fight that he's actually introduced as a character that we should give a shit about because of his connection to Sekai. And it's like, that's so late for me to start caring about this. Like, you don't even set up Sekai has saying that's like, oh, the reason why I left my master is because I had this friend or whatever that, like, he left and I want to go find him. There's not even, like, a hint that that character exists in the history of the show. It feels like they had the idea for that character's backstory the moment they started making the episode that the character features in prominently. And that's, like, an issue that when it happens, that episode's enjoyable and the concept is good in and of itself, but its like impact to me is like significantly lessened by the fact that it just kind of comes out of nowhere, and then as soon as it's over, it's done, and then you just move on to the next thing, and it doesn't feel like it's nestled properly in this bigger sort of like envisioned story that the whole season is telling.
Yeah, no, I won't disagree with that. Yeah, it's something that I think clearly like doesn't bother me as much, but it's definitely a problem, and it's something that I think you can kind of feel, and it makes sense, especially when you just look at the air dates of this versus the original show, and it's like, oh, they're laying the tracks as the train is coming. Like,
yes.
you can't write a show in 6 months. Like, and again, like, yes, the season splits for something like Double O are like that, but clearly before Double O animated a frame, they knew what the story broadly was going to be for 50 episodes. So it's different here because they, you wouldn't have ended Build Fighters the way it ended if you were going to immediately turn around and do a second season. I think the choice to do it not as a second season but as a separate show is the right one broadly. But yes, if they'd had a year to plan this, I think a lot of what we're talking about would have just arranged itself better, Because it does feel like, okay, the first couple episodes, they have the basic premise of the show, and that's good, and they execute well, and it has a strong start, and then it gets a little bit like, okay, well, do we jump right into regionals? Well, let's do this episode with Gyanko, and then let's do this episode at G-Muse, and those are both fine episodes on their own, but it's like, where are we going with this? And then, okay, let's do some regionals. Oh shit, none of these characters in regionals can be at nationals because they beat them all. Let's do a training arc and introduce who will be there in the second half. And then while we're doing the nationals, we need to fill out the roster. What if we had someone else from the Jigen Haoryu? Oh man, we should have done that earlier. Well, let's do it now. Like, do you know what I mean? There is kind of that feeling of like, we're laying down the tracks as we go along. I think the show disguises it somewhat, like it moves fine in the direction and all of that stuff. It's light on its feet in terms of humor and character writing, but there is that structural issue. And I guess that is like the difference I would like draw here is I think Kuroda, the writer, is still clearly just a very talented anime writer. Like, I think on the moment-to-moment level of like character interplay, humor, the pace of individual episodes, all of that stuff, I personally feel that stuff is still very good in Try. Probably not always as good as in Build Fighters, although sometimes I find the show even funnier. I think there's some very funny stuff in it. It is kind of that broader, structural level stuff where, the best writer in the world might struggle with that if you had to turn it around in this amount of time. And I can imagine this being, roughly as good as the original if if it had been made 2 years later or something. And I guess it's just for me, I respond plenty fine to the sort of moment-to-moment stuff that Kuroda and everyone is doing here, and that works for me. That the structural stuff doesn't bother me as much, but I'm not saying those problems don't exist.
Yeah. Let's talk about something I think we could both agree is good, even though, like, if we're doing our fantasy thing, there's a way better way to deploy this character. But let's talk about Gyanko a little bit, because she is... if the most successful character in the show in terms of like its narrative execution stuff, I think is Minato Sakai. My favorite character is Gyanko. She is the Sei's mom of this show, right? She's the character that's like, is the character like actually super important in like a major plot way? Not really, but is the character like, do you just smile every time the character's on screen because you love her? Yes, because Gyanko is the best. Gyanko's voice actress I like a lot, Ryo Hirohashi, who she voices... maybe the character I find is like the funniest character in an anime. She's a character called Yamada from an anime called Working, which is kind of like a workplace comedy set in a family restaurant. And the Yamada character is a 14-year-old girl who has like run away from home, and she's very very petty trivial reasons, and she's just hiding out at this family restaurant and is using Yamada as an alias because she doesn't want to tell them her real name, and she's awful at everything, and they just like hire her out of pity, and she ruins everything every time she touches it, and it's a hilarious character that is just an incredible performance. It's a very different performance, I guess, than Gyanko, but the voice actress has like really strong comedy chops, and I feel like she brings that to Gyanko really well. And just the whole idea of she's the little sister of that asshole kid from the first show that like tried to like force Sei into building a gunpla for him. And that kid was a piece of shit, but Gyanko is amazing, and she's got 2 Gyan shields as like berets or whatever for her twin tails. It's just, what a fucking great character.
It's a phenomenal character design. the fucking, when I realized, I'm like, oh my god, those are Gyan shields, as you say, like the hair clips or whatever you would call them. We're not women, I'm sorry. We don't. You and I have very short haircuts,
yes,
and always have, and we're very boring on that level. You and I could not pull those off. Gyanko very much can. She's like even more all in on the Gyan stuff than her older brother was, and I love that. She's made it part of her fucking attire. She's got like, and the various Gyans she has in this show are just fucking great. In the Tri-Island Wars OVA, which we will talk about at length on the next episode, she has one called the Gyansalot, which is one of the best names for a Gundam ever, and also one that I am going to need to build. I think that's my favorite of all the various Gyan variations in these two shows. It's really good. But yeah, she's great. I like, she should be part of the national tournament. I think that's a shame, and it is the reality of if you're doing a tournament arc, it's hard to have someone they beat in the regionals, and I don't know how they would do it exactly, but
they don't. Like, that's why it's, like, crazy, because they do the, like, scrimmage fight or whatever in episode 3, and they do win the scrimmage fight, which they shouldn't have won that fight. They should have lost that fight. That, I think, is also a really bad bit of plotting to have them win in that kind of fight so early on, which is the first time they fight as a team. They should have lost because their teamwork is shit, and their teamwork is shit for the rest of the show, because the show doesn't really do a lot of actual team dynamics in its fight choreography. So it's like, if it had, built in a plot device there to have them try to work on their actual teamwork and have them lose to Gyanko there. But then also, the way they use Gyanko in the preliminary tournament is she just loses to the people who are like the runners-up, right? They're the people that they fight, that Sekai fights in the last match of that tournament. And so they kind of, I guess it's not actually fridging in that Gyanko's not dead, but in a tournament anime sense, they kind of fridge the character or use her as a jobber to like sort of like make the opponents feel more threatening or powerful or whatever. And it's like, what a waste of Gyanko. You could have just said that she's part of another region. Her team won that, whatever that region was, and then they meet in the national tournament instead of like the 3 kids that have like the fucking King Ghidorah. I mean, I like King Ghidorah, but it doesn't really fit in Gunpla. Those 2 episodes are pretty bad.
I watched these episodes like a week ago, and in my memory, they did fight Gyanko at the end of the regional tournament, because that just makes more sense than what they did, and what you're suggesting makes even more sense than what they did. Like, yeah, she should obviously be in the national tournament. And they should have lost in episode 3, and like, if Gyanko is like out there as someone they had to face at the end, that also just gives more motivation. Every character you can kind of save up for the national tournament is another feather in your cap.
Exactly. That's one of those things that the original show did so well, is it knew where to like, okay, let's use a bit of this character here, so that way we know them, so that way when they start coming up more prominently in the story, like Mao or Isla or Niels Nielsen, you know who this character is, so you start building a really strong attachment to them. And it's like they do that with Gyanko, but then they don't have any of the payoff, because she's not actually a major factor of the tournament. She's just there to hang out with Sekai and flirt with him, and that's kind of it. And it's. I mean, I'm happy to have Gyanko whenever I can have her, but the character deserved more than what the show could give her.
They did, although the other thing that I fucking love about Gyanko is their team name is Team Song Dynasty Vase.
Yes.
Which is, like, Tri does many fewer, like, Gundam references than Build Fighters did, and I think probably correctly so, because there's probably a law of diminishing returns on that. But, like, Team Song Dynasty Vase is a perfect, like, if you don't know, that's, like, one of his last lines is, like, well, he mentions it somewhere that there's a Song Dynasty vase. Makuve is all into that kind of stuff.
Well, that's when he dies, he has that vision of the vase shattering.
Yeah. Yes, right. He says, get that vase to Caecilia, is like his last line. Make sure Lady Caecilia gets that. So it's just a terrific fucking joke. There's a reference to Makuve in the Battlelog that is one of the only things I liked in Battlelog. It's great. I love all the Gyan stuff. And then the gag in the final episode that she has a little brother who's also really into the Gyan is just, I love that this family is just Gyans all the way down. It's great.
Yes, and that the little brother is, like, they just basically shrink down the character from the original show and then have them voiced by the same lady. It's a really good gag. Also, thinking of good gags, so because as you say, the show does far fewer Gundam references, which I agree is like for the show's benefit, partially because the show doesn't have a character that's like Sei, who kind of would ground those references in, like, because when Gundam Build Fighters does a reference, those jokes can be funny even if you don't get the reference, because it's character humor based around Sei, because he's a Gunpla fucking lunatic, right?
Right.
And this show just doesn't really have something like that, which is fine. But there are a couple of really good ones, and this is where you still have, we haven't really talked about with Raul-san, they had to recast the character, but this is still, in episode 3, you have the original Raul, and where he's characterized like he was in the original show, and Gyanko's mobile suit is the R Jaja, but changed to the R Gyagya, and the joke is these like, oh, but in the original setting, the R Jaja was actually based on a modified version of the prototype of the Gyan, and it's like has this big long description about why the R Jaja is actually like a super deep cut Gyan reference, and that is like probably my favorite Gundam reference in this whole like show, is just like that whole bit, and Raul-san just like going ape on how fucking great the R Gyagya was, which is also, the R Gyagya is a very good mobile suit.
Yes. Do you want to talk about Mr. Raul really quick? Because so Mr. Raul comes back. He is basically the coach of the team. I do love the idea that Raul-san has not moved and he just hangs out with the kids who play Gunpla and lives vicariously through them. That feels like what he would be doing. And like, if you're gonna bring a character back from the original show, why not bring back Mr. Raul? Again, any sports anime like this needs the old character you cut away to like explain things. Just let it be Mr. Raul. Don't fix it if it ain't broken. But Masashi Hirose, who voiced Ramba Raul in the original show, longtime Gundam cast member, and Mr. Raul on Gundam Build Fighters, he does the first 4 episodes, and then for still unexplained medical reasons, he is still alive, but he does not work anymore. This was basically the last thing he did as a working voice actor. And then starting in episode 5, he is recast with Katsuhisa Hoki, who I know as the voice of Jimbei on One Piece. He's in lots of different stuff, and I like that actor a lot, and I think he does an admirable job. That is a big set of shoes to step into, and I think he does it. I think his version of Mr. Raul is one I very much like, but it is obviously sad when that switchover happens, because you want, obviously they wrote this show with the idea that Masashi Hirose would be around for it, so it's obviously a shame.
Yeah, and it does feel like, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I pretty strongly suspect that they like pretty dramatically rewrite what they were going to use the character for when that switch happens, because the first couple of episodes after the switch, like they have Katsuhisa Hoki basically playing the character more or less the way that Masashi Hirose did, but and Katsuhisa Hoki is a fucking great voice actor. There's nothing against him, but he has a very different quality of his voice than Masashi Hirose did, and the character is just not as funny, because the character is much more sort of like stern and serious. Like, he sounds more like you would think the character would sound just by looking at him, whereas like Masashi Hirose played this version of Raul as a little bit more kind of like, deep down he's this kind of like, nerdy young kid in an old man's body, and so there's this very kind of silly aspect of the character that's not really there so much in Katsuhisa Hoki's performance, which again I don't think is like a problem, because you can't really expect another actor to play the character the exact same way. He needs to play it how he feels he should play it. But the character past that point, past like episode probably 6, 7, or 8, then is not in the show as much, and when he shows up, the like most of the jokes around the character kind of go away, and he's more just sort of straight up this kind of like fatherly coach figure, and it does feel like, I feel like the show, unfortunately, nothing, it's not the show's fault, but it does lose something by the fact that it loses that sort of like grounding in Gundam, that I think is part of where some of like the later Gundam Build Fighters try stuff. I don't always feel the same like love and affection for Gundam and Gunpla and the hobby and all that stuff that you really get a lot in the first show. I think one of the big reasons is because you don't have Raul-san there to sort of like found the show in like the roots and DNA of Gundam itself, is one of the things the character did in the first show through Hirose's performance.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. Katsuhisa, Hoki, obviously phenomenal actor, and I like that he goes in a different direction with it a little bit. I think trying to imitate Hirose would have been the wrong move, absolutely. And I think what he does is he plays to his strengths, which is a sort of warmer version of the character that's a little more down to earth. And those first couple episodes, it is a little surreal because the scripts were clearly already written for Hirose. And then, as you say, they kind of start rewriting. And I think Raul-san is perfectly effective in the mode they kind of rewrite him into, because Katsuhisa Hoki can do that, and he's good at it, and he's still pleasant when he shows up on screen. But yeah, like, Mr. Raul was clearly like in the planning of Gundam Build Fighters Try meant to be our connection to the Gundam stuff. Like overall, this show is going to do fewer of those references, but when they happen, we're probably going to push those through Mr. Ral, so it's like character based, as you say. And then once you lose Masashi Hirose, it's unfortunately not something you can really do. So I think I agree with your analysis here.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but we did, you know, when he showed up, he did get that fucking incredible art gag.
Yes.
So it's like he, you know, while he was working on the show, he got some really good shit.
Yeah. And wherever you are, Hirose-san, I hope he's doing okay, because he was a great actor. And he's still alive. We don't know, you know, he's retired, and I hope he's okay and enjoying his retirement.
You know, actors should be allowed to retire. It's like, It's one of those professions that it feels like you very rarely get it, where like you just, especially if they're successful, it's like they act forever until unfortunately they physically can't anymore. It's like, just enjoy your retirement, man. Like you did like multiple like legendary all-time great characters in the history of anime.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I screened the Gundam trilogy for my students here at Iowa, and they fucking loved Ramba Ral. It is something that endures over decades, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. So, all right. Where else do you want to go with this discussion? Are there any other? Let's break down some other characters here, because you mentioned Ganko as like the character that one character that works really well for you. But then there is our Kansai boy in this show, whose name is escaping me at the moment. Minato Sakai. Okay. Right, because it's Sakai, not Sekai, and sometimes that confused me. Okay. Minato, who is our, like, I think it's an interesting choice they make. They have another, like, Kansai character who is sort of our comedic character, but he's nothing like Mao from Build Fighters. I think that's a fun choice they make. Like, Mao is, like, one, like, voiced by a girl and, like, is younger and is just over-the-top, like, sort of silly in that sense. Also has, like, the most over-the-top Kansai accent you'll ever hear in an anime. For Minato, it's a little more pared down, and he is this, like, kind of egomaniacal kid who also, I think, goes on the best character arc over the course of the show. Because the whole idea is that he just wants to prove he's the best builder, and he is mad that Yuma is now entering the fighting tournament because Minato wasn't interested in that. He just wanted to build a better Gundam than Yuma did. So he winds up begging this other school to let him in. What's the school he goes with? It's the Build Busters. It's Team Build Busters, and that is in the Osaka Tendaiji Academy. And he, like, begs these kids at his school to, like, please let me into the club so I can fight at nationals. And they wind up letting him in, and over the course of his arc, he is still arrogant, and he's an idiot, and he has a lot of funny comic material, but he also genuinely gets invested in being on the team, and I think the best episode of the show, pretty easily, is the one where they fight him at Nationals, and you have the Tryon 3 in its full glory, and also Minato having, I think, a pretty darn good character arc there.
Yeah. I think generally he's the funniest character, that they give him the best gags. The performance, which I feel like I haven't seen this actor...
Kazuyuki Okitsu?
Yeah, I've seen him in some stuff. I feel like some of his biggest stuff I haven't seen. I think he plays like a younger Jonathan Joestar in the original JoJo's. But he gives a really strong performance here. And this is the character that to me is like the most successful part of Try, partially because I think a lot of his stuff is the most distinguished and feels the most different from the original Build Fighters, down to what I think is like the best thing in this whole show, which is the cold open to, I think it's episode 21, is the one where you get introduced to the Tryon 3 at the beginning of that episode, and you see his mobile suit for the first time, and it's basically it's like a Voltron sort of super robot gag that he's made 3 different mobile suits. One's like a lion that's like the Tryon Earth, basically, the Tryon Air, which is a bird, and then the Tryon Water or Sea, which is like a big like fish looking one, and then they all combine together to make a big, again, Voltron-esque super robot type mobile suit. And when they do that, every single person, it's super over the top. You have like the logo flashing on screen. It's animated basically in a different style from the rest of the show, which they then bring back for when they do the fight, which is fantastic. But then the best payoff is that like every single person in the audience is just like dumbstruck and dumbfounded by it. And then it cuts to Meijin Kawaguchi, and he's like, well, you know, Gunpla is for there are no limits to Gunpla, I guess. It's just like
Yep.
everyone's shook because it's a super robot, right? And it's like it has abandoned everything you think of from the Gundam franchise, which is where the real robot subgenre comes from in the first place. And so the whole gag of him making a super robot, I find tremendously fucking hilarious.
It's fucking hilarious.
So good.
And then it also makes for episode 22, Follow Your Heart, is where Tri-Fighters face the Build Busters. And it's where you get the Tryon 3 in its full glory, and it is the best fight in the show. Like, it is such a creative piece of choreography because it is so different. It's utterly different than anything else in this, or Build Fighters, or Gundam in general, because they're fighting a big fucking Voltron-esque super robot with a big fucking lion face. It's great. And then I think also it narrows down to the Yuma-Minato dynamic, which is a really good one, because Yuma doesn't, like, actively think of Minato as a rival, which is funny, but I think over the course of that fight comes to, like, respect him, and Yuma realizes, like, how much he really cares about not giving up, and I think this is one of several scenes from this show I posted on Twitter that I really liked, and that ending sequence to Follow Your Heart, where they have their final battle, is just a spectacular piece of direction. It's, like, the shot choices. They do these, like, really cool, like, eye level, like, things where they, like, do the colors differently. I think Yuma's vocal performance is really fucking great there. It's just a really, really good ending to that episode, and I think the payoff there for Minato as a character, and he has a little bit more. His stuff in the finale is legendarily hilarious, but it's a really solid episode. Like, I feel like even if you're someone who does not like Build Fighters Try the way I do, on the whole, you would have to admit that's a pretty good episode of Gundam Build Fighters.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best episode of the show, like, easily.
Yeah.
You know, it also, luckily you get a big fight scene that it also gives you a rest from having to hear Jigen Haoryu 500 times, because it's like, they're like, Sekai, just, like, off to the corner, please, just let someone else have their fight scene. It's like, thank you, okay, let's go.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I agree with that, and, yeah, overall, like, yeah, anyway, it's really good. I love Minato. There's an episode earlier when, like, the national tournament is starting, where they're all, like, listening to, like, the announcements, and Yuma sees Minato sneaking over by an elevator, and I posted that scene on Twitter, too, because it's basically the whole gag is that Minato was about to see Yuma and realized this isn't dramatic enough an entrance for my rival, and so he tries to go hide in the elevator, and Yuma catches him, and Minato, like, just goes on this whole fucking, like, monologue. First he thinks he's talking to himself, then Yuma is there. Yuma is just the perfect comic foil there. It is, again, that's what I mean when I say, like, Yosuke Kuroda has not, like, lost it between series at writing really good character-based humor. He can throw that off, I feel like, very easily. That's just something that's clearly, like, comes naturally to that writer. And it's very fucking good stuff.
Yes, no, yeah. That gag in the elevator and all that that's one of the better jokes in the show as well. Yeah, like, I think just in general, I think, like, Minato Sakai is the character that the show just, like, 100% nails for me without, like, really any qualms.
Because his place is perfect. Like, you wouldn't... Yeah, exactly. Like, he wouldn't work, I don't think, as the final antagonist of the show. He's exactly where he should be, which is, like, in the semifinals. It's Yuma's big kind of character wrap-up so that the finale can be a little bit more about Sekai, which is kind of where the show's heart lies. You know, I wish there was also a fight that more clearly did that for Hoshino, because you want that, and anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
It's good stuff. I like that side. All right. Where else do you want to go with this? I mean, is there anything else we should break down about sort of our main central trio? We've talked about them all in the abstract, and I've said I like them, and we've obviously talked about Sekai and some of the limitations of that character, but is there anything else to say there?
Yeah, I guess, like, for me, one of my big frustrations of the show is that, so it has the premise of it's about 3v3 fights, which I think is, like, a good, you know, idea of, like, trying to differentiate yourself from your predecessor, which, you know, had a couple of team-ish fights because you do have that duo of, Sei and Reiji, but generally the actual fights themselves are all one-on-ones. So it's like, I like the idea, but I do feel like they ended up biting off way more than they could chew with it, because the show runs into a couple of problems of how you choreograph and design and build action scenes, and then also how you design, like, antagonists, because if now you have to have 3v3s, that means you have your 3 protagonists, but now every team you fight also then must be composed of 3 people, and other than, I guess, maybe kind of the team they fight at the end of the preliminary tournament, sort of, and then the Gunpla Academy, there are no other teams that have 3 members on them that are all 3 of the members are like actual characters. It's always, here's the character, like Minato Sakai, and then here's 2 background characters that have like a couple of lines of dialogue. There's like a vague narrative for some of them. Like the Minato Sakai's team is probably the one that gets the most of, there is like a dynamic there of him having sort of like shoved his way onto the team or whatever. But generally speaking, they kind of don't ever have much in the way of, here is an interesting opponent for like each of our characters to fight. That basically never really happens, where you actually have a good 1v1 lineup for each character, which would be one approach for a 3v3, is to design most fights around Fumina has a character that's her main character to fight on this team, Yuma has a character that's one of his main characters to fight on this team, and then Sekai has his character, and you can build action scenes around that dynamic. Or you can try to do more team-based fight sequences, where it's really about like tactics between the team members and being a squad. And they don't really do either. Really, almost all the fights in Tri are about trying to get rid of 2/3 of the characters in mobile suits as quickly as possible, either by having the enemy mobile suits transform into one, which they do at least twice, if not 3 times over the course of the whole show, or you just have like a bunch of them get knocked out as quickly as possible and pare it down usually to Sekai being the one left, or like you have Yuma. I don't think Fumina ever is the only one left standing, but she does win like 1 or 2 of the fights, because she definitely wins the fight with the King Ghidorah-esque mobile suit. But generally speaking, they don't ever, for me, find a way to express a sense of like teamwork and cooperation and friendship between the 3 team members in action scenes. And that's something I find very lacking in the show, is that like it feels like whenever it comes to the action, 9 times out of 10, it just is about like they just put the ball in Sekai's court and he just kind of takes over those scenes, and it's all about the other team members trying to support him as much as possible or get out of his way while he has his dramatic like Jigen Haruyu shit that he does to end the fight. And that dynamic is one of the things I think I find personally most disappointing about the show. And it hurts my investment in the team as a whole, that like their team dynamic breaks down a lot when you get to the actual fight scenes. And it also makes me a little bit annoyed at Sekai as a character, because the way they use him sucks so much of the oxygen of those fight scenes with his big martial arts stuff and his like martyr-esque trait of him getting hurt physically when he's doing his moves and stuff like that. That is one of the things that like about the team dynamic in the show that for me doesn't work particularly well.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I do think the show generally tries to create one-on-one matchups in various ways. Like, it very rarely is actually 3 people coordinated fighting 3 other coordinated people. They almost never do that. They will fairly frequently do matchups where it's 3 one-on-ones going on simultaneously. That is what the final fight is. Well, it ends with Sekai, but you do have 2 other distinct fights, and I think that one's pretty good. The one with the Tryon 3, I think, works very well, because while the other 2 characters are not as important as Minato, they are very important to Minato. And so in that episode, like, Minato has almost won and tries to leave, and because he knows he can win if he just plays out the clock, and he wants to like live up to his teammates, and they're like, no, we've been on this journey together, we want to keep doing the fight. And like, so there's a very like real character dynamic going on there that is not 3 dynamic characters, but those other 2 being there make Minato more interesting, so that works in that incident. And then, as you say, there's a lot of other ones where maybe we know one of them, and then there's 2 others. Usually in those cases, it's another let's transform into one. You have the 3 brothers with the green SD Gundams who create the big dragon monster that is a pretty cool fight. I like that one a lot, but it's another like we're going to fight a giant mobile armor thing. And yeah, so it is something that I think it is too bad. I wish there were a couple more fights where, and I don't know if you can do in 25 episodes a tournament where you have enough characters that this is possible. Do you know what I mean? Like,
you certainly can't do it in a show that is structured the same way that Gundam Build Fighters is, right? Like,
no.
you can't have 2 tournaments in a 25 episode season that does that. You could have maybe done a 1 tournament, right? And if you had pulled it off that way and set it up and built it out properly, and you'd have to have most fights would be like probably like full 2-parters. Like, there are a lot of fights in this show, and I think I do have a problem with this, where they have a habit of splitting fights in the middle, and having fights take place over the course of 2 episodes, but it's not like, but it's 1 episode's worth of a fight. They just fucked around a lot for the first half of an episode, and then they have a fight in the second half that then just ends on a cliffhanger, and then they resolve that cliffhanger at the first half of the next episode, and then do a little bit of setup, and like the episodes feel like they're almost out of sync a little bit. That happens for like most of the World Tournament until they get to the Sakai fight.
It's not all of them. It's so you have the first two-parter in the show is the one that is against the Snibal Drago Gira, the big the three
the King
SD
Ghidorah
Gundam boys. Yeah, the King Ghidorah. Then you have the Sekai Junior one right after that, which is a two-parter. And then I don't think there are any more two-parters, like because then you have the one where the Gunpla Academy fights the Lucas Nemesis. You have the Follow Your Heart episode, which is one part, and then for the final fight, episode 23, Build Fighter, ends with the fight about to start, and then the fight is all of 24. So, little different. There's only two where they split the fight in the middle, and I agree in both of those cases it is bad pacing.
Yeah. So it's something where if they had, I think, thought more strongly about what this sort of like 3-man cell thing of like the 3-person team dynamic would entail, I think it would have gone a long way to making the show, for me, significantly better. Because that's, I think, maybe my biggest hang-up with the show is that it ends up not, to me, like feeling like it has anything meaningful to say or convey about like friendship or teamwork, because most of the stories don't really have anything to do with that. Most of the stories boil down to, and then Sekai wins the day. And it's like, while you're telling me that teams are important, what you're showing me is that this guy is important because he's very strong. And did he build his own gunpla? No, but that's not important because he's very good at martial arts, and the other people will fix it up afterwards. Like, I think it's not something that the show is like trying to give that impression, but to me it ends up giving that impression because of how much they centralize Sekai in the action. And it's very frustrating because I like the characters. Like, I love Fumina. I think that Fumina is a really cool character. She pops really well, but she ends up being in the tournament like very unremarkable overall because she doesn't have, there's not enough oxygen in the show to give to that character for her to like breathe and like be something interesting on her own and have her own ideas that she's expressing. It ends up most things in the show revolving around how does this connect to Sekai in some way, and that frustrates me a lot for a show that's supposed to be about a 3-person team dynamic.
You know, I mostly agree with what you're saying. I think I would argue that Fumina and Yuma get more to do than you're saying. There's a reason why I bought my star-winning Gundam, and I love it so much because I think there's a lot of cool stuff with that. But I think largely I agree with the main critique, and I think it's a problem of conception, because if you're gonna do like Kamiki Sekai on his own, I don't think there's anything wrong with the character, but the character is very clearly modeled from the Domon Kashu like side of things, right? I mean, clearly that's his like master and all of that. He does not have the brooding aspect of Domon Kashu, like personality wise he is Goku. But the thing is, Domon Kashu and Goku never fight on a team. And they never could. Like, you would not... You know, it's the same thing, like, you wouldn't do a One Piece arc where Luffy had to fight with 2 other people and do a team fight. Like, because they make jokes all the time. Luffy just runs off and goes off half-cocked. Like, right? Like, he just goes off and goes crazy because he just wants to fight. Sekai is the same way. That kind of character is just fundamentally incompatible with a team-based story. So, and Hoshina and Yuma are not. Those are characters who are really good for a team-based story because they're very invested in it. And so I like Kamiki Sekai, but is there like very obviously a disconnect in doing a story where you want to do a team-based thing, but also you're going to have the boy who has the magic fist who can end every episode that way? Because one of the biggest things this show takes from G Gundam, and I think it does it with more variety than G Gundam, over fewer episodes, which helps. But it basically does the, like, Shining Finger thing, which is that Sekai can end a fight the way Domon could with, like, he has a new Shining Finger thing. Like, G Gundam is a little more repetitive because it's usually just the same Shining Finger a lot, and the fights are worse. And in this show, at least, like, there's a little more strategy. It's not literally him doing the exact same move to end every fight, and it evolves over time, but it is a similar problem of that usually he has some big flashy martial arts move that can end it, and if you're relying on a single character who can do something like that in a team-based scenario, that would be weird. You know, if if Dragon Ball were Goku had two other people who he was fighting seemingly equal with, but then also every one was going to end with him doing the Kamehameha, you wouldn't really think those other two team members had anything to do, because they wouldn't, right?
Yeah, and